My name is Angel Jones. I'm the CEO and founder of Homecoming Revolution, which is a one-stop platform that showcases all the opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa with a view to repatriating the African diaspora professionals. And what we do is showcase the careers, the entrepreneurial opportunities, property relocation services, and all the advice about coming home. I'm very excited today to be with, on our far left is Ebenezer Isoka, who's the CEO of Standard Chartered Bank. He's based in South Africa, and he's the area general manager for Southern Africa, and Ebenezer is originally Cameroonian. Then we've got Kushinga Makamba, who's the country managing director for Guardian Managers Africa. She's based in Johannesburg, but was born in Zimbabwe. Then we have Jared Lachina, Director of Strategy of Excel Overseas Holdings. He's based in Dubai, and he was born in South Africa. And then we have Sandra Idahan, who's a consultant at the Boston Consulting Group, based in Johannesburg, but originally Nigerian and American. So we have a wonderfully mixed bag of African talent up here to tell you about the post-MBA career opportunities on the continent. I want to start quickly about Homecoming Revolution. We've been working in South Africa for 10 years and now have expanded to repatriate into East and West Africa too. We have seen the brain drain retention ranking in South Africa move from us being 80th worst in the world to 47th worst in the world. We're definitely seeing the tide is changing. There are 30 million African diaspora living abroad. And it's been reported that in the next 3 years, there's going to be a 75% increase in the use of expatriate and diaspora staff. So really, Africa's time is now. We are seeing the tide is changing. And from our research, what we are seeing is what makes Africans return home. Number one is friends and family. Number two is that sense of belonging. And the third reason we're finding that people return home is the idea of being able to live not just a life of success with these blossoming career opportunities back on the continent, but also what people are calling a life of significance, the ability to be able to really make a difference, and that idea of a sense of purpose going hand in hand. So now I'd like to start with our panelists onto the far left, starting with Ebenezer, and going along, please. And really, it's a top-line comment about the post-MBA careers in Africa, and your opinion of, is there a brain drain reversal or an enduring exile, and what for you is the Africa value proposition?
Thank you. Again, I work for Standard Chartered Bank, a company that has been in Africa for over 150 years. My view is there a brain drain? No, not today. Used to be in the past. That's because it's a boring statement. It doesn't exist any longer because Africans have been moving back and forth. And beyond the continent of Africa, professionals have been moving around the world these days. In my day, and I'll tell you, my day dates back to the 80s when I graduated from the US universities. I had my MBA, started my career here with Bank of Boston. Going home then was a big challenge because it was unheard of. You couldn't go back to Africa and leave the United States of America in 1982. It was unheard of. I left, I went, never regretted the experience. No, I regretted one. My darling sweetheart, I couldn't marry her because I had to go back home. And she didn't know where Africa was, and she thought Africa was terrible. And she was a lovely American woman. We've remained best friends ever since. So, in the past, yes, there was that issue of a brain drain because everybody migrated to the States and wanted to make it home. But today, I'm speaking from a Standard Chartered Bank's perspective. What we see today is a mix of talent moving across the world. And when they come back, when we recruit from institutions abroad, such as Wharton, Columbia, Yale, London Business School, etc., and take them to Africa, we move them around the globe. So from Wharton, you can find yourself in South Africa, in the Johannesburg office. From the Johannesburg office, you can find yourself in Kenya, in the Nairobi office, to Lagos, to Singapore, to Hong Kong, to Malaysia, etc., and back to London. The examples are here. My colleagues are here from Standard Chartered who've moved across this space and have been on that journey for a while. So if you ask me today, from a Standard Chartered Bank's perspective, I think we've redefined it. There is no longer a conversation around a brain drain, conversations around the movement of professionals across the world. That's what we do best. That is one of our DNAs, and that is at the heart of everything we do. So the Africa Value Proposition, if you want to make a change, if you want to feel you have an impact, and this is best described by storytelling, you have a choice to make. You can stay in Wharton and play and work in some of the best companies in the world, but you never have a chance to say, I reached out in life, I transformed an individual to be a multimillionaire. That conversation I can have today because I left the US in 1982 and returned to Africa and have touched and transformed lives. And some of the emerging billionaires you have in Africa today are people who have accompanied on that journey. And I'm proud to say making that difference, making that change makes me unique, and that is why you should think about doing it. That's the real value proposition. Come make a change, and the time is right.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I totally agree that there is a brain drain reversal. I'm a classic example of that. I was born in Zimbabwe, but I moved to the UK when I was very young for school, and I lived in England, and then I lived in Philadelphia, so I was away for 22 years, and this year I just returned to Africa. I moved to Johannesburg. And I think the very real thing is the fact that back in the day you would leave, you'd come here, and nobody would ever speak about going back home after school because it was just unheard of. And if people left to go back, it was usually because maybe they couldn't find a company that would sponsor them to stay here or such thing. Or even if you said to people back home, I want to come home, they'd say, what are you coming here to do? Whereas now you find a lot, like my younger siblings, a lot of people that are way younger, immediately by the time they finish undergraduate, they already want to go back to Africa. There's a definite mind shift. But the reality is also back in the day, there weren't that many opportunities, and one of the things that keeps people over here, I think, is within your careers, there's incentivization. You get paid a certain amount of money, and you get accustomed to a certain lifestyle. And now Africa offers that. So I think it's become something that's a very real opportunity, but not just talking about it, but you know that if you go, you can not only match their lifestyle, but in most cases even probably have a much better lifestyle. So for me, that's the brain gain reversal. And the value proposition that Africa has, exactly what Abby said, there's a lot of opportunities for you to get involved in hands-on things. I feel when you're over here, you can work for great companies and have them on your CV, but you can't really take part in building things. And in many parts of Africa, the industries are not saturated. So especially if you have an entrepreneurial drive, in Africa you can really build something from scratch and see it through. And there's a lot of young people doing amazing things that I feel you get to see over there in ways that you don't see here. Here you read about them, but when you're in Africa, you see it every single day, these entrepreneurial stories. So the opportunities, and of course everything to do with being closer to your family and still being able to have all the things that used to make you want to leave and be far away.
Thank you.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me? Or okay, we'll just use this. So I guess I'm the only one not currently living in South Africa. So I didn't originally intend to actually live or work overseas. Started recruiting with consultancies and banks out of undergrad in South Africa, and then got a Fulbright, which then sent me to the United States. So started studying there, and hadn't really thought about working specifically overseas. Had the opportunity to do so for a hedge fund, though, right at the beginning of the financial crisis, which was a very educational and interesting time that you wouldn't be able to experience in a different location. So much of the reason for me being overseas was driven by a very unique opportunity set driven by the time. In terms of the current situation, I think I would agree that it's changed a lot. When I look at people from my high school or university who went overseas, most of them would go to the UK because of the setup there being easier for South Africans to move there, in terms of visa. Nowadays, you're seeing a lot more people essentially going everywhere. It's no longer just the UK. They're going to the United States because of the opportunity to travel. They're going to Asia because of the opportunity set there. They're going essentially globally, rather than just being defined by a place that they can necessarily earn more money or that is easier on them from a visa perspective. So the nature of the travel has also changed. And I think the return element has changed as well. When I look at the kind of work that people are doing overseas, their main focus is what they're picking up and what they're understanding and learning for the perspective, potentially, of moving back home. I mean, it's not guaranteed, but it's very much forefront in their minds, versus, I think, a prior generation that would have seen wealth creation or earnings as a lot more paramount in their decision. And so as a result of that, you're seeing people going into a variety of situations and then bringing capital, ideas, networking, all of those kind of opportunities that you can't necessarily get if you're just working in your hometown, bringing that back, and that's beneficial to everyone. And I think the last element of that I'd like to talk about is just in terms of opportunity creation. I think that really is the biggest way that you're going to be able to get people to return to those countries. I look at people who I met during master's programs and work, people who come from countries, regardless of whether the country tries to encourage them or what their feelings are towards it. I mean, I know a lot of people from, for instance, Syria who love their home country and that kind of thing. But they're not going to move back unless there's opportunities and stability that will encourage them to do so. And so, whether you look at the Chinese example with a lot of, people from China who were part of a diaspora that are now returning to start businesses and invest their capital, through to Africa, which is experiencing a resurgence in that area, I think very much the opportunities that are being created in your home country are what are going to incentivize that. And so I think that needs to be a big part of policy and the way that we try and drive the return, as well as looking at the positive aspects of it.
Thank you. So I agree that I think there has been a very strong reversal of the quote-unquote brain drain. I feel I fall into a kind of different category here where, truth be told, I'm actually American. Both my parents are Nigerian. They left Nigeria in the mid-'80s. I lived in Nigeria until I was 3, so any Nigerian will tell you, she's American, is what they say to me. And I am very much American in my identity and the culture, my language, my accent, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there are so many more people who fit my type of profile who are actually now interested in going to Africa. I don't even say going back to, because in many cases, these individuals have never even lived on the continent. And I think when you start seeing that happening, that really shows a shifting paradigm. I'm part of the generation of people whose parents left with no considerations of ever returning and left so that their kids could be American and have opportunities. And it's fascinating to them now to see that the opportunities they made for me are actually back home. So I think there is a very strong reversal of that trend. With that said, I think there's still a bit of a gap. Definitely when I was graduating from business school just over a year ago, 2012, a lot of my classmates were shocked that I would go directly to the Johannesburg office. They thought it was strange that I wouldn't try to start in New York and then transfer later on. People were buying into that concept, but the idea of going straight there was shocking to them. And without jumping the gun on some of the other topics we'll speak about, but the questions were, well, what happens when you want to come back home to America? People won't respect the experience you've gotten. People will question whether or not you were good enough or whether you went to Johannesburg because you couldn't cut it in New York City. So I think that element is still out there, but I think there are more people willing to take the risk and opening up the avenues to going directly from a place like Wharton straight to Nigeria, Ghana, wherever.
Absolutely, and I think it's so exciting to be alive at this time in our generation where Africa really is opening up for opportunities and we've got technology. So we really are able to change perceptions quite quickly about what's actually going on in the continent. What Homecoming Revolution does is tell the stories of people who've returned home. And we tell the good bits and the bad bits. It's very important to acknowledge that it is a trade-off to return home. Many people tell how the trade-off is worth it. And we have Moki Makura, who waited for ages. She grew up in Nigeria, went to live in England, Ivy League there, then worked in Johannesburg, and only 2 years ago found that perfect opportunity to move back to Nigeria. Whereas you've got Daudi Ndwiyila, who moved back to Uganda. He just took the leap and just went. All of them, though, have this love-hate relationship with home. I think everybody does. There are good bits and there are bad bits. And I'd now like to challenge our panel and ask you, in your opinion, what you think are the good bits and the bad bits as compared to living overseas, about what you find about being back in Africa. Ebenezer.
I guess I have to change my cars more often because the roads are not great. I guess I have to buy a generator for my residence because the infrastructure is not a given. I guess when I started a business in Côte d'Ivoire as an entrepreneur within a global corporate, a Standard Chartered Bank, 2 days after I got the license, there was a coup d'etat, and I still had to build a business. And by the way, good bit is that within 18 months, I did break even. I went through 4 presidents to start a business in a country. So that's experience in Côte d'Ivoire. So that's a tough bit. I had to work with those experiences. The positive ones I'd like to focus on. And by the way, corruption is a given. Political instability is a given. The infrastructure deficit is a given. Those you would have to struggle with. If you want to have the streets you have in the States and feel it, stay here. Don't come to Africa. Seriously, do not come. If you want to have an experience that changes your lifestyle, come to Africa. I'll tell you why. The myth, those are the facts. The myth is that you cannot make money in Africa because of those problems. And that's a myth, Standard Chartered for 150 years. We've demystified that. In every single African country, our return on equities are second to none. You do not get those returns, which are north of 30% in Europe. You do not get them in the US of A. You don't get many opportunities to be an entrepreneur within a global corporate. You don't get too many opportunities. And for us, returning home, it is not a one-way ticket. Or returning to Africa, it's not a one-way ticket. Is Adi around? My colleague Adi, who will be giving a keynote address later on this evening, is a young man who's been to Nigeria, London, Dubai, London, Nigeria, serving fun across the space. Obina, you're here. Antonia, who is ex-Wharton, she's in London now. She's a proud Nigerian who is in London. She's done deals in Ghana. She's done deals in South Africa. She's been to Asia. That's what we do. So from our part, the beauty of going back to Africa, the sweetness of it is that you get a chance to do all these wonderful things. You get a chance to change lives. And beyond the business we do, the money we make, which is a proud thing to talk about, there is one discipline. In all the businesses I run, from my Johannesburg office, if by some miracle you have to leave the Joburg office and find yourself in New York, in Paris, in Singapore, in Kuala Lumpur, you should and must be able to execute without a complex. So the fact that you're in Africa doesn't mean you're a second-class citizen in the professional world. We do not stand for that. I do not stand for that. I will go to Japan any day and chair the management committee of a Standard Chartered Bank in Japan without a complex. That is a prerequisite for success in Standard Chartered, and that is the beauty of it. You create international professionals these days across the continent of Africa. That's a positive. But the infrastructure gaps are there, guys.
Okay, so I've only been in South Africa for 5 months, so my experience might not be as deep as everybody else, but I'll say the negative things for me have been things in Africa just don't work the way that you're accustomed to them working here. And the worst thing, especially when you're dealing with this government sector, regulators, things like that. So for example, I'm in South Africa building a new business. I'm building an Africa office of an existing British boutique investment management company. So when you're dealing with the office that's abroad and you're telling them that things here don't work the way that they work, that they have timelines, they have budgets. If you apply for something here and the city or the state tells you in 3 days you've paid expedited fees, it's going to come out. In South Africa, so far, for us anyway, it has just not worked like that. And that translates into, like a domino effect of how you run your business. So that's been the only negative thing that I can honestly say that I've experienced. And the infrastructure issues, I haven't really experienced issues with like power, water, all of that, but South Africa is just not as
She's in a Joburg CBD.
no, and one of the reasons, I'm from Zimbabwe, one of the reasons I didn't take the leap and move to Zimbabwe is because Zimbabwe does have those issues. And if you are accustomed to, just not having to deal with not having water, not having adequate healthcare facilities and all of those things, that's the honest reason why I didn't move there and why I've met a lot of different Africans. This is one of the positive things actually about being in South Africa. You get to network with people that are from all over the world and are doing absolutely amazing things, and they're at the highest level of their career, and you have access to them in a way that when you're over here or maybe in London, you don't have direct access to that. So those people that you want to meet or hope to do business with, you're dining at the same places, you are living in the same areas, and that just translates to opportunities for you.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. The sort of network effect that you get from being in a city like New York or London that is very much plugged into the global infrastructure, although that's changing rapidly, right? No matter where you are, you're now able to engage a lot more in that. But there's still an element that, at least now and maybe for the next couple of years, is missing to a small degree. In terms of electricity shortages, South Africa has had its own issues recently with some power failures a few years ago. But those are of the nature similar to, California, I think, had that sort of issue 10 years ago with blackouts. The infrastructure lacking is very much not an issue in certain areas where most of the business is taking place, and gradually it's rolling out, so that's improving. I would agree with most of what they're saying. I think it's the difficulty is going from that pace and speed that things seem to happen in the global centers towards it being a little more sort of slower and relationship driven, but it's like that in Asia. It's like that certainly in the Middle East and Dubai. If you want to get anything done, you've got to know someone who can help you with the process. The final part that I guess just to mention as a South African that always seems to come up is crime and safety. And look, there are elements of that are a little different when you go to a region like South Africa and parts of Johannesburg. But I always remember a friend of mine from Texas in the US saying he didn't understand how I could live in a country where you had to worry about your safety. And he comes from a region where every now and then there's a storm and a tornado descends from the sky and rips your house out of the ground. And, to him, that's completely normal, right? So if you're in a setting that is a little different from a security perspective or something along those lines, you do become kind of used to it. And so I guess one of the big purposes of this panel is to talk to people who are interested in moving to those parts of Africa, looking at the opportunities. I don't feel fundamentally after you're in Joburg, maybe every now and then you check your wallet kind of thing, but you're not concerned in a way that is fundamentally different to if you're walking down an abandoned alley in New York, or the sort of things that you think about in any global city are going to be the sort of things that you're going to be thinking about in Africa. So I don't think it's as cut and dried as it was maybe 20 years ago when the quality of the roads was like a major issue that could prevent you from moving to a region.
From a consulting perspective, I think the work we do in Africa is just extremely dynamic. Not to poo-poo on the people from BCG who work in the US, but I think the nature of the work is very different. If you're in New York, Boston, Chicago, you work with Fortune 500 companies. You tend to work with the director of a division, and you help them become this much more profitable. These are companies that are very well managed, that are well run typically, operate in an extremely competitive environment, but the issue you're helping them with is how to squeeze the last bit out. And if you look at the work BCG does in Africa, instead we're helping companies build from the ground up. We're helping governments become more efficient about their power generation. We're speaking to presidents about how to raise economic development in the country based on the GDP that's coming to them. It's completely different. We work C-level, C-1. I think the opportunities to do incredibly powerful and meaningful work come to you more frequently when you're operating in Africa as opposed to some of these very well-developed markets. And I think for students, like more students that are in school right now, the opportunity to get exposure to those types of conversations very quickly are much more bountiful and plentiful if you're working in Nigeria, Johannesburg, et cetera. The flip side of that, as everyone has already stated, the infrastructure, the kind of atmosphere around you. I think I left the client site at around 4 or 5 p.m. Lagos time yesterday. spent 3 hours in traffic, spent 2 hours trying to get through a check-in line at the airport, then sat for 4 hours, then the flight was delayed for 3 hours, then there were no apologies, no information. That doesn't happen if I'm flying out of New York. So, you do have those elements that you have to deal with, but, you take the good with the bad. Those elements are why the work you do is so dynamic and so powerful and so meaningful. So, you just have to kind of package it together.
Exactly. I suppose there are so many opportunities because there is so much work to be done. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the wonderful Nigerian writer, speaks about how important it is that as Africans we are proud of our problems. Every country has its problems, and why shouldn't we look at them intensely and think what can be done? The idea of diaspora returning home as well, with this thought of, all right, I'm home now, let me see it happen, and returning home with a bit of an arrogant attitude, we've seen hasn't worked very well either. I mean, if you look around here and all the wonderful skyscrapers in Philadelphia, we remember that somebody actually built those. They took a long time to build. There's a lot of building that needs to be done in Africa. We're noticing how, as well, what Sandra was alluding to, that when people come home, they aren't just in a strict job spec. They are doing quite cross-functional, multitasking roles, which is very, very stimulating. And I think that's what you need to look in the mirror and ask yourself, am I ready to do more than is asked of me? And is that the time to come back? And what we're noticing as well is a trend of people who are coming back into corporate and then after a couple of years moving into entrepreneurship. So Ham Namakajo, for example, is a Wharton alumni who then came home to head up Google in Uganda, and 4 years later has left that and has now started his own digital business, Axumoid. And we also see Tunde Ogunrinde, who came back to work in Chicken Republic for many years and has now started his own consulting business. And so my question in particular to Ebenezer and to Sandra is from an HR role. Are you seeing that the careers you offer are a relative soft landing and then people wanting to spread their wings further? And what are the trends that you're noticing in encouraging people to come back? What are the negotiated packages you're finding you need to get through?
I guess you're like that, right? Well, your package is good as your ability to negotiate. Let's start with that, okay? And you keep eventually. But the entry packages, you have to negotiate. And believe me, if you're good, there's no need for a complex. And modesty is not a virtue when you negotiate at that point. So if we're going to approach you in Standard Chartered says we want you to join Standard Chartered, mind you, a package is not just the net cash position that you end up with. The package is the experience that we bring to you. The package is a lifestyle we bring to you. The package is a network that has been talked about. The package is that unique opportunity where you would say it's an investment to go back home. Yes, my colleagues in New York would probably do $2,000 more for 6 months. But 2 years down the road, you have a chance to make a lot more than they'll ever make in their lifetime. And I speak from experience and experiences I've had with people I have recruited. So I'm not just telling a story. There are people I've recruited from Uganda, Kenya, Sierra Leone, the Gambia, who have made expatriates across the Standard Group, who today sit in Singapore, they sit in Hong Kong, they're doing things there. From South Africa, I've moved a lot of our colleagues from to other parts of the world. So the entry package into the continent, it depends on the institution you join, was different. But years later, when they earned their keep, their lifestyles were transformed. That's the value proposition you would get with some corporate entities. But on balance, we should also realize that entry to Africa should not just be to corporate Africa. Africa is looking for leaders in the public sector. Your pay, the package you get in the public sector won't be the same like you get in the private sector. Not everybody will work for BCG and be a Sandra and earn those billions she's earning. It'll be different. I mean, Koshiga is here. Not everybody will do as well as she's doing if you're in the public sector. But we need professionals in the public sector who, at the end of the day, will run the countries. So the balance I'm giving you here is, yes, the corporate sector would make it attractive for you to come in. Packages will be much more than those in the public sector. Private, public, the divide is there. There will be a difference. But then I think you have an opportunity to make a difference in either sector, public or private. And I think we should look at those as opportunities. Now, entrepreneurship is a given. We create entrepreneurs within our company. That's one thing we have done. We have had people do things they would have never done if they were on their own, but we give them those opportunities that enable them to do startups. I have a team now that is working on setting up our offices in Mozambique. I lead that team. The average age of the team members is approximately 27, actually 26.5. I did that calculation. Those are the guys taking us into Mozambique. And by April next year, we will have a big business in Mozambique, presence in the country. Angola, we just completed it, similar age bracket. The guys in IT, the guys in origination, the compliance team, legal, guys in corporate finance, etc., private equity are all young, brilliant talent that we push into those markets. So those, to me, I call them entrepreneurs within the global corporate. So the issue here is not just on the net cash, total cash package or the net cash you get, but those global, those overall experiences that we give, and I'm sure other institutions do give their colleagues.
Thank you.
Yeah, to build on what Ebenezer's outlined, I think consulting provides similar opportunities. We're actually in the same building in South Africa.
I know.
Yeah, we maybe battle it out with you sometimes for talent. But I think it's a very soft landing. There are a lot of opportunities that come to you when you join a consulting firm. We're able to relocate to a location you want versus some of the corporates in the States, you need to put in 5 years before you can relocate to Nigeria, to South Africa, whereas you can go directly there through the consulting angle. I think we are as well helping to build the business of BCG. So I spent the last 4 months doing work in Nigeria, helping to build our base business there. I was part of the first tenure of people who came over to our South Africa office, helped to build the business there. So there are a lot of ancillary benefits, let's call it. So you have your base salary, you have your package, whatever's typical of a consultant, but you also have all the other pieces of being at a frontier market and helping to drive the expansion of these corporations. And I think that provides you a great opportunity. Then you can obviously later on move onto the corporate side, or as you outlined, entrepreneurship. I think the biggest issue for the corporations is not in attracting people, it's actually in keeping the talent, because there's so many great opportunities, because you're able to network and have high visibility. Then a few years down the line, people want to move on to other opportunities. So I think from a student's perspective, it's coming through Standard Chartered, through BCG, through the corporate firms, it's a great angle to get yourself into Africa. I think from the business perspective, it's how do we retain the talent at these places.
Absolutely. And Kushinga and Jared, from your point of view, you're doing a lot of work within Southern Africa. What are the opportunities you're seeing particularly there?
I can speak for South Africa. So I see there's a lot of people who are coming into mining. I think financial services is definitely the biggest sector that I see most people getting recruited into. But there's a lot of demand also for people who have technology experience that is transferable across sectors. And I think one thing to just mention, especially for people who are thinking of going to Africa, is a lot of people have degrees that are great over here, but sometimes when you get to South Africa, for example, because it's a different education system, you might find out that for you to then be able to get into that sector that might be so attractive and you're experienced in it here, you have to take exams, or there's certain things that you have to do to go backwards before you can leap forward. So I would say people need to be really mindful of that, because I know quite a few people who've moved without really getting clarity, not because they didn't research, but some of these things you find out once you're there, that some of these things are not as straightforward, that you might see that a lot of people are getting recruited into certain sectors, but it doesn't really translate to you being fully ready to get into that sector coming from over here. And in the industry that I'm in, which is financial services as well, a lot of the great thing, which is something that was alluded to this morning, is that a lot of people who are in Africa, who are very experienced, who have gone to school there and have never left have a lot to add than sometimes all of us sitting in a room like this. Because when you're over here, the temptation is to feel like when you go to Africa, you're coming from abroad, you have this broad knowledge and you're a more attractive candidate than people that are on the ground. So I'd really encourage people that when you are looking to move, and if you have connections, if you have friends, if you have family, you should find out what it is. Try to get some context, because if you don't have the Africa context, it also makes you a little less attractive than maybe a counterpart who's on the ground, who might not have the Ivy League credentials, might not have the big consulting firms and banks that they've worked for, but they have a context that you can never learn in a classroom. So that's...
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think in terms of personal opportunity, I know one of the reasons why my firm hired me was because of the fact that if you do live and work overseas in the way that I have before, that's positive in terms of doing the kind of job that a lot of current, private equity and banking or consulting roles require. It's not about having to go to a region and, go home every week necessarily. They want the kind of people who are interested in wherever they may end up and are going to be able to leverage that into new business opportunities. The job that I do now is different from the consulting role that I've done in the past, in that now I determine when I'm going to travel to a region. No one's telling me. I've got to look and try and figure out what the situation is going to be, whether it's going to be a valuable trip. And so that then, the ability to judge that and also deal with it, where you yourself are kind of guiding your career progression and the direction that the firm is going in as well, is very much driven by the kind of people who are comfortable with moving to a new region and understanding different cultures and figuring out different parts of the business. On a corporate side, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity. Our firm deals mainly in luxury resorts and hotels. Obviously, there's huge growth in that in Africa, both from foreigners, but also, more importantly, from locals who are looking to, see parts of the continent that they haven't themselves before. And the other element that I think that's interesting and that hasn't really been brought up is when compared to global business opportunities, Africa presents an opportunity that's almost very like Wild West feeling, like no holds barred, there's all this opportunity. But that's very different from a lot of regions that people think are like that, but actually aren't. If you want to start a business in China or even Latin America, you've very much got to go through business connections where, the government's going to potentially will just tell you, like, forget it, you can't come in. You've got to appoint government people to your board. You've got to be heavily involved in that. Now, not to say that's not necessarily the case in certain countries in Africa either, but the wealth generation that comes from foreign entrepreneurs moving there is generally a lot higher than you see in other countries. In other countries, generally, the very wealthiest, who are generating like billion-dollar deals and all that kind of thing, are almost strictly locals. Foreign businesses or foreign entrepreneurs coming in can gain wealth, but they're not necessarily going to like coin it big. Whereas Africa, maybe because of the fact that there's a little more freedom from that perspective, there is the opportunity to do that. And I don't think that that's highlighted by, and it needs to be highlighted in conversations with your peers, with potential investors, because it's a very real opportunity, right? It's not saying, oh, there's this opportunity in Africa. You can point to individuals who've moved there from literally anywhere. Asia, tons of corporations from China and the Far East are moving to Africa and making a lot of money. And those are the kind of opportunities that will drive further investment, further individuals traveling. And I think that that's where a big part of the positive business element lies as well.
Ebenezer and Sandra, do you want to add to that in terms of opportunities you've seen that haven't been mentioned yet?
Well, I think it's one of those, definitely. Those opportunities that you talk about, because we've moved, again, our business, we have a footprint is basically Asia, Middle East, and Africa. We're an emerging market-centric financial institution. So we've seen growth come from India for years. You've had Indians in East Africa and West Africa, in Southern Africa, they're there. You have the Chinese who've come in who have made a lot of money. You have Nigerians who've moved to South Africa, have made a lot of money in South Africa. You have South Africans, the likes of Cyril Ramaphosa and the rest of them, who've moved out from South Africa and made a lot of money in Nigeria and other markets. You have Dangote from Nigeria making money in other markets within the continent. So yes, these opportunities do indeed exist. And the corporates that facilitate these processes. Now, to this audience, the question is, can you be one of those? My response will be in the affirmative. You can indeed start, And not every one of you should be looking for jobs with corporates or other institutions, etc. Some of you could be natural entrepreneurs. You've had enough experience to start your own bits. It's going to be a bit difficult. The journey is not going to be smooth, and it's never smooth in the States either. In the best of times, even in America, I lived here for a long time, very long time, and I know what it takes. My kids are in school here, so I know what it takes. It's not that smooth, it's not that easy. But I've had a lot of my colleagues who've been natural entrepreneurs, have left the US, set up shop in Africa, and we talk of growth in the SME sectors. There's a lot of room there, and there are lots of inefficiencies there. I've had colleagues who've come in with $1,000, and today they have net worths north of 500,000 US dollars. Initially, only the Lebanese did it well. Initially, only the Indians did it well. But today, Africans born in Africa, raised abroad, Africans born in America, and African Americans going back home and making a difference. So those opportunities do exist. Some people are taking advantage of those, and I would encourage you to do so. But then, if you want to be in the corporate world, need I tell you, there's only one place to be, Standard Chartered.
And a little arm wrestle across the table here. You fine. So we're seeing it certainly across the continent, across all sectors, consulting, construction, IT, financial services, tourism, agriculture, consumer goods. We see the fastest growing consumer segment is food and beverage on the continent. We're seeing lots of opportunities there across that sector. What we're also seeing is that people's decision to return home is not the head. It's not the job that sways them. It's this emotional pull. And so what we do is combine the stories of people who returned home and that trigger moment, that emotive moment that we then showcase. So, for example, I lived abroad for 7 years, and my moment was when Madiba came and spoke at the embassy in London, and he looked over all of us freezing cold South Africans, and he said, "I love you all so much, I want to put you in my pocket and take you home." And the crowd went mad, and I burst into tears going, "What on earth am I doing here?" And then the opportunity came up where I convinced the Saatchi brothers to open up a branch in South Africa. So it was a combination of that emotional definition of what your purpose is with that career on top. And so, Sandra, what I want to ask you is, when you are looking at specific candidates, what do you look for? And during that hiring process, what are the wooing techniques you use, or the hardships of actually getting the candidate there? Are you finding an over-demand for the roles you have? Or can you talk us through your process a bit in terms of the hiring?
So the process for consulting, it's pretty formalized. For people who are coming through undergrad or MBA institutions, it's usually funneled through the schools, and each of the schools has their own recruiting process. So broadly speaking, it's actually very segmented and specified, and you go through the recruiting process. Speaking about what types of individuals we're looking for, I think it's analytical skills, communication skills, the types of skills we look for in any of our offices across the globe. But there's also an additional element. It's the element of wanting to be part of an entrepreneurial office. So, unlike the types of people who go to our Boston office, we need people who are helping to build the Johannesburg office. We want people who are interested in spending time on the continent and experiences on the continent, be it Americans, be it Africans who've left. There's no any one specific profile, but I think the unifying connections is that the unifying connection amongst all the people we recruit is that everyone is very passionate about Africa. Mm-hmm. So similar to the story you told, there are people who lived in Africa for many years and left for school and have come back. There are people whose parents lived in Africa and they have never lived in Africa. There's some who studied. There's someone in our office who did the Peace Corps for a number of years. There are any variety of profiles of people who can show and display their passion about the continent. And I think that's the missing element. That's the additional element that's very critical for the types of people we recruit, different from a Boston, New York office.
There's that wonderful thing that it's not having passion and tenacity. passion is tenacity. You're not going to be able to keep pushing at it unless you're passionate about it. And I think certainly the clients we work with look for those kinds of African diaspora who have a deep-rooted commitment back to the continent and not just sitting back waiting to be handed a career on a plate.
Absolutely. Sorry, and just to build on that, partially because of the dynamic environment we described earlier and some of the hardships, that's why you need the passion. The passion is what will help you break through some of those difficulties to find the opportunity. It's not an easy environment to operate in. You definitely make some sacrifices going home. But there's a huge benefit on the other side. And so we need people who are willing to kind of thread through the difficulties to help our clients become more successful, help us build our office and our footprint on the continent.
Yeah, that sense of belonging, to actually see that things are improving day by day and knowing you're playing a very active role in that. Before we open the floor for questions, do we want some final comments from the panel before we do that?
Well, I guess for me it's just important to know yourself, have an agenda, know what you want to accomplish in life, believe in it, passion and the right attitude, you should make a difference. And really what we're saying is, it is not a question of going back to Africa. Not every African should return to the continent. My brother is an African who is an American. He is very successful in the US of A and has no intentions of going back to Africa. Let's make that abundantly clear. We're not coming here and saying, everybody of you should get on the plane tomorrow and go back to the continent. What we're saying, if you really are passionate about going back and making a difference in the continent, yes, there are numerous opportunities there for you. That should be made abundantly clear. I've spent north of 25 to 25 years recruiting talent into the continent. We've got some of the best and brightest, and we hope we'll get a lot more from Wharton. And I see the audience, some of you are not from Wharton, some of you from other institutions. So I won't mention those institutions because this is not their day. But yes, you also have an opportunity. You could come to the continent. So my parting comments would be, with the right attitude, you can make it anywhere in the world. And Africa definitely presents you with that opportunity. If you went to the World Cup, and if you listen to if you watch any match in the World Cup, you had a young lady who said it's time for Africa. If she could say so, I'm sure you know better.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, this time last year I attended this conference, and at that point I had made a decision that I wanted to go to Africa, and I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do, but that passion that you're talking about was there. And a lot of us who've been here, we've lived through seeing the media where Africa is referred to in very negative ways, and you don't want to talk about being African. And when you've seen the transition to Africa being this place that everybody wants to go to, there's something that happens in you where you feel almost like you don't want to get left behind. But what I'd really like people to be careful of is you also get people who've moved. People talk big. They'll tell you, if you come to Africa, you're going to do so well. I have a driver, I have a maid, and we're all living in mansions. It's not true for everyone.
True for you.
But the truth is, there's a lot of opportunities, but it's not very easy. So you need to sort of have a very clear plan and network. Talk to people. People are always willing to help, but if you don't ask them, they don't know that you need help. And also, I would encourage you, if you can, to just actually go and be on the ground. Don't look for jobs while even if it's just going home for vacation for a month, staying with your family. Don't pay, you're not paying for anything while you're there. It makes a huge difference, but you also get to see for yourself whether all these big things that everyone is saying are happening over there are actually for you, because you might realize once you get there that it's not for you. But absolutely, even this forum over here, network. This worked for me. I pretty much got the job that I have now is sort of kind of intertwined with attending this conference, and I know a lot of people who've attended conferences like this in the past and have used it for that purpose, and that's helped them to go home. So, I'm sure everybody over here will be willing to be those people as well that you can talk to for finding out how it is that you go from being over here to being over where we all are now.
Yeah, I think that the major difference and the opportunity that we have now that didn't exist before is that it's very easy to move overseas and it's very easy to come back. I mean, we've discussed, global corporate, that sort of nature, making it a lot easier for you to transfer. But I'll be honest, if I had to move overseas for postgrad in like the 90s without Skype and without, the ease of being able to book a flight on kayak for 8 hours time and getting on a plane and that kind of thing, I don't know what my experience would have been like. I might have really not enjoyed being overseas. That level of flexibility means that you can go to all these different kind of places and make use of those opportunities. Again, if you have the passion and if that's what your interest is in. And I think that's a very unique perspective for our generation, the ease of that travel. And then in terms of the opportunities, I absolutely agree. And you're right, there are a lot of people who talk big and say, land of milk and honey, and then you arrive and you try and get your phone connected and it takes 6 weeks. And, there are a lot of things that you'll face in those cases. But I think the opportunity that moving back home gives you is that the sky literally is the limit in terms of the kind of work that you'll be doing. I look at the job opportunities I had even before moving to the United States that were available in South Africa from consultancies and banks. And I assumed that it was that easy to get job offers from all these different places that easily. And you move to New York, and it's a lot more difficult getting a number of offers from top consultancies and top banks. Not saying it's impossible, but you just look at the opportunity that's available in South Africa with a variety of different organizations that want people like you working there with global experience, with those kind of networks. And it really does present you with the opportunity, and you're not held back by the assumption that at this age you can only be in this position or whatever it may be. You've got that kind of flexibility, and if you don't like the corporate environment, the entrepreneurial environment is fantastic. The amount of energy and that kind of thing available to people moving there is just unrivaled. So huge recommendation from my side.
Sandra.
Sure, I'll add to what I've stated about BCG. Obviously, BCG, some of our competitors, we all have a broad footprint in Africa now and growing daily. And those are some of the best avenues to get yourself into Africa because there's a very clear-cut, specific recruiting channel. So anyone who's interested in those opportunities will be at the career fair later, happy to discuss those with you, tell you what it looks like from inside a consulting firm and what that transition is like from a consulting perspective.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. If you can stand up and say your name and where you're from. Should we start with you, ma'am? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Galila Sapatu. Actually not a student anymore. I'm in the consulting business. So my question is around, you guys talked a lot about ways that people can kind of enter Africa, either go to take a job at Boston Consulting or go directly being an entrepreneur. So my question is more on the entrepreneur track. Once you did your networking, once you did your market research, gathered the data, you kind of figured out what country, what your service offerings are, what would you say are the top 3 things that you think you should do next? So there's an idea of having your plan and your strategy, but how do you make it executable? Like what would your recommendations be to fill that gap?
Fine, let's take that question and then the next one. Yes?
So my name is Brandon Southburn. I'm a student at African Business School. Would love to get your perspective on whether you think Africans who spend a long time out of Africa and also non-Africans are regarded with suspicion and take most interest in moving to Africa in general.
Good question. Is there a third one?
Hi, my name is Bertrand. I think more of a comment than a question, actually. I moved back 4 years ago. I think going back is more about the mindset, right? Because you have to have the right mindset. South Africa is soft landing in most cases because infrastructure is there. But when you go to countries like where I'm from, you go to Nigeria, it's a little bit tricky. So if you want to go back, you have to make sure you're ready for it. I mean, there are times where it was Boko Haram bombing or you have security checks every now and then. These are things that you really need to know what you're passionate for. It's also very important that you have a family back home who can give you that support structure, because without that support structure, sometimes you might actually just go crazy. Now, it's the reality, because I've seen a lot of people come back and they had a wrong idea about what it would be like. The opportunities are there. I feel like I've met more multinational CEOs in Africa than I can actually have met in the United States. But I think it's really, really about the mindset. You really have to have the right mindset to actually be able to make it work.
Fantastic. We'd love to get your story. I'll find you after this. I think it'll be inspiring for other people. Who would like to pick up on those questions?
I can pick up on the
Kushinga?
suspicion one. I think one of the challenges is when you live over here and you attend schools like this, it's ingrained in you that you should be confident, almost to a point of having a bit of arrogance in how we interact with people, or when you're going for job opportunities. I think the most important thing that I found is you have to find a balance between having confidence and some humility, like sort of understanding that I want to come to work with you people, and just have this humility of I have almost saying I have nothing to offer, even though you have a lot to offer. Because I think what they don't like is people who are arrogant. I've met a lot of people who have an attitude where they feel like, well, you left and now you're back, but we stayed and we built all these things. So what do you think is so special about you? But it's all in the approach. It's completely to do with your approach. If you come with humility and then your work or your credentials then come after, people are more impressed with you than if you come with, hey, I went to Wharton and I worked for all these people and I'm in Africa and you need me. And that's what I've realized personally anyway.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll add to that. I agree with you 100%. But I also tell you, it depends on the organization you join and the values of that organization. So there is a conversation around values. In my company, we rate people for performance, but what makes people become leaders is the rating we give them for values. So we do have values, and we pay attention to those values. I have no problem whatsoever recruiting a confident person in my team. I have had Americans, and I have real-life examples. The current CEO of Standard Chartered Bank in Japan is a gentleman, Christopher Knight. I recruited from our office in New York in 2001 and took him to Cote d'Ivoire. I made him a CEO in Cote d'Ivoire, CEO in Jordan. He was CEO in the business in Nigeria before going to Japan. Did he struggle? Absolutely. Did the wife give him a hard time? Yes. She didn't understand the opportunity, but today is she happy? She's the happiest woman on earth. So I'll tell you, there is nothing wrong with that. Now, the question is, was he accepted readily? Yes, because he made an effort. He realized he had to work in concert with colleagues. To deliver, there's an element of codependence. You're not a prima donna, you won't survive on your own, and you would make it on your own. Whether you're American, English, or African who's lived here and is coming back home, there is nothing wrong with being a bit confident. We need confident people. But there is a borderline between confidence and arrogance. You should never dilute your value. If you've got something to offer, go for it. Don't go in there and saying, there's a time when modesty is not a virtue, let's be clear, and there's a time when you must accommodate others. But accepting that as codependence makes a big difference. The question about entrepreneurs and how you do it, what you do, I think the basic things, if you've done everything else, you've got to be passionate about it. Execution is all about passion, resources, because at times with some entrepreneurs, they're passion, but they're absolutely broke, they have no money. So, I mean, if you're looking for a natural incubator to take care of you, sort you out, do everything for you, you might not have one. So you need some money from somewhere, okay? That's what we need. And it leads me to the third point. You need to have that network then that can open you up to opportunities and introduce you to people who can help you make a difference. And that's what I'll say. Welcome home, and I'm glad you went back. So great stuff. Your family network worked for you. And by the way, when you talk of family, was it nuclear or extended?
Both, actually.
Good, Sandra.
So I'd like to pick up on the question around suspiciousness. This actually came up on a previous panel. I think for myself and for most consultants, it's twofold. It's what is your experience like at BCG, and then what is your experience like with the clients? And I think both of the points earlier speak to those two dual pieces of the question. Within BCG, it's all about the values of the firm, as Ebenezer outlined. So for us, we have any variety of people working in our Johannesburg office. Stefano Nieves is one of the partners from our office. I'll try not to butcher the stat, but I think Of the 40 some odd consultants in the office, we have about 25 nationalities represented. So that's an incredibly diverse work atmosphere. Who would be the person to be looked at suspiciously in an atmosphere like that? We're all from all over the place. Well, maybe Stefano, the French accent, it's still a bit suspicious, but aside from the French accent, I think everyone's treated with respect and dignity, regardless of what their experience on the continent is. However, that's within BCG. Once you go externally, then we fall into what Kashinga outlined, which is, do our clients look at us suspiciously if people come to them who are foreigners? Oh, you come to Nigeria and you come to tell me how to run my business. Who are you? Where are you from? I think to a certain extent, most consultants always have that experience, regardless of if there's a cultural barrier. So we have two hurdles to get over. You have the consultant hurdle, and then you have the cultural hurdle. And I said the exact same thing earlier, which was humility. I never try to say that I am a Nigeria expert. I'm far from it. Any Nigerian will see through that very quickly. So I tell it honestly, I'm not a Nigerian expert, but the value I do have is that I have families, friends, family members who are very much Nigerian. And I know how to operate amongst Nigerian people, which is not an easy thing for people who have zero experience with Nigerians. The culture is very, very different from American. So I understand what that looks like and how to sit in a room with 20 angry Nigerian men, and it doesn't scare me, just to be frank. And the flip side of that is that, for better or worse, when you're looking on the corporate side, a lot of management still expatriates. It's just the frank nature of the business right now in some of these countries. And I know how to operate in that expatriate atmosphere. So I do have a strong benefit I bring. I can play that dual role, but I never try to position myself as any kind of expert to people who are local. You have to have humility to understand what they bring to the table and what you bring to the table, and then work from there.
Just very quickly on the suspicion point, I guess a lot of suspicion is sometimes driven by prior experience of, foreign executives coming through and saying, increase sales by 30%, or why did you have all these accidents with, transport, like the logistics within the business? And you've got to explain to them that the roads are not the same here as they are in California, where you've just come from. So if you go into the environment with the aim of showing that you're open to learning and aware of local challenges and that kind of thing, I don't think you'll have a big issue. I mean, it's when you go to the US, regardless of your high school scores, you don't expect to be elected, king of the Ivy League or university that you're going into. You're aware that there's a lot of learning that needs to take place. And it's exactly the same when you go into a new environment overseas, regardless of which area you're going into. If you're open to learning, then I think it's fine. And just in terms of things to be aware of on the entrepreneurial side, I don't think you can focus enough on the network and how important the network really is. It drives so much more. The Middle East is the only other area I've experienced where the network is so fundamentally important to getting stuff done and succeeding from a business perspective. So really make that a huge priority.
In fact, what we're seeing with Homecoming Revolution, with the entrepreneurial opportunities, is encouraging people when they return home to partner with somebody on the ground. So somebody who has been there in the community for a while, who you actually partner with, so that you've got the credibility with your community and you're bringing your international expertise in terms of whatever role you're going to nominate there. Are there any more questions? Right at the back.
Hi, my name is Barclay Beckley at Yale School of Management. I was just curious, some of you have kind of done this and touched on it, but how would you rate as a strategy for somebody who's looking for more of a sort of soft landing? It's important to be on the ground, build your experience, build your network. But for some of us who have like a longer-term entrepreneurial desire, but are seeking for the right platform to kind of get our feet wet, get established, how would you rate that as a strategy? And who are the players you think, it probably depends on the sector, but who are aggressively moving into Africa, multinational banks, et cetera, that we can kind of leverage our background, have a platform and work, but also potentially have a longer-term entrepreneurial interest?
Thank you.
I'm happy to speak to that. Actually, Yale alum from 2012, so I recently had the same questions you had, and I very much needed a soft landing, being someone who lived in New York for most of my life. I'm a bit biased here, but I think the softer landing is more on the corporate side. Obviously, amazing opportunities on the entrepreneurial side or public sector, but I think the more you remove yourself from the corporate, the further out you go, the harder landing is, let's say. from the corporate side, you have the multinationals, you have consulting firms, you have banks. But I think there are also opportunities with some of the African companies too, large African companies such as MTN or people who've been operating in Africa for a very long time but are playing in the corporate atmosphere. So that's another angle for you to look into. But if your focus is on getting some experience and then moving out into entrepreneurship, I think corporate is probably the best angle. Again, not for everyone. It depends on what you're interested in and what your passion is. There are people who go back and do nonprofit opportunities, do amazing work there too, but obviously the hardships are much greater once you take that industry angle.
I think one of the big areas of opportunity is going to be in the service and consumer area now within Africa. If you're looking for an area that similar to what I guess China was in the 90s. If you move to China now and you're trying to focus on like mining and that sort of resource extraction, those opportunities are not really that interesting. Like what you want to look at is the growth of like the consumer and service sector area. Although even now that's a little late. I think in Africa, with the commodities boom, we've already focused intensively on oil extraction and commodities extraction and everything. Not to say that won't keep going for many years, I'm sure it will, but the area, if you want to go in and have a fundamental impact on the strategy of the firm, then services and stuff at the moment are only sort of in the initial launch phase, in terms of rolling out to the new middle class and expanding. And so I think that the degree of opportunity there, again, one of those sort of once in a generation opportunities is to move into a field like that, which will allow you to have, punch way above your weight in terms of necessarily like your education or level of employment or whatever, because of the fact that it's such a new area of industry and it's going to be so impactful over the coming years and decades.
I think I agree with that. Just to build on that, the sectors are very simple. FMCGs are great for that, soft landing in the corporate space. I think it's important. Africa is all about FMCGs, infrastructure, and commodities. Of course, I saved the best for last, financial services. So those are some of the victims and the readily acknowledged ones. So that will give you a soft landing. But clearly, with that, you can make a difference. And no, really, I'm not being biased here, but in banking, I've had a lot of colleagues who've left the banking sector, and maybe some consultants also, and been able to set up shop on their own. Because the opportunities they got in a bank like, by the way, Standard Chartered is not just discovering Africa. We've been there for 150 years. So with those opportunities, we really, with the experience we've had, we have a chance to see across the sectors, and the brilliant guys have been able to set up shop on their own. I've got a lot of colleagues who've left the bank and set up shop, and they've been doing extremely well. So banking is a good sector for that.
And Harford, if I may do a plug for Homecoming Revolution, please join us. It's free to join. Go to homecomingrevolution.com. We send newsletters out. There's content on there about how to plan your move home. All the jobs are on offer there, the entrepreneurial opportunities. And I'd say to all of you, we think Africa's got maybe a 10-year gap right now. Ali Khan Satchu, who moved back to Nairobi, he, after a successful career at Goldman Sachs in London, he moved back. And he said, I didn't want my son one day looking at me and saying, Dad, where were you when it was all taking off in Africa? And another homecomer who said, I wasn't moving back, I was stepping forwards. So thank you for today. Look in the mirror, find your passion, trust your heart, and all please come home at one.
A billion people back home,